Hello, and welcome to the program. This is the Black Ponder. I'm Neil Trotter. And today we're going to bust out with the e-reader and we're going to talk about some Angela Davis work right here. This is Are Prisons Obsolete? So what is this about? Well, it's about what the question is asking. Are prisons obsolete? Are prisons antiquated, ineffective, archaic, and inhumane? Are we at a point in human advancement, evolution, where we should be beyond prisons, the need for prisons, what prisons are? As you can see, what I'm asking here is philosophical questions, because this is a philosophy channel, and that's why this work here is very good, because it looks at this question philosophically. Now, a lot of people are going to hear that question and they're going to be telling me or you or whoever, of course prisons are necessary, right? Where are we going to lock up all the bad people? You know, people need to be punished for heinous crimes. They need to be put somewhere. There needs to be some area or some location or some institution where we can put lawbreakers, people who commit crime, particularly people who commit heinous crimes. We need a place for that. You know, and if we don't have that place, what are we going to do? Well, Angela Davis asked that question. She asked, well, actually, there are a lot we can do besides prisons. And she also makes the argument that prisons really aren't effective and they're obsolete. How so? Well, we're going to read some quotes from the text. That's how we do things here at the Black Ponder. And we're going to delve into this. So maybe you have this book and you would like to follow along. I will get that comment where people tell me, oh, you should put the page numbers where you're making the quotes. This is going to be a little challenging because I got the e-reader, but the quote I'm going to read here is from page 66, according to the e-reader. And I guess this is the last sentence, starting at the last sentence of this block quote, okay? Just in case you want to follow along. So I'm going to read this. From 1990 to 1998, homicide rates dropped by half nationwide. But homicide stories on the three major networks rose almost fourfold. During the same period when crime rates were declining, prison populations soared. Yeah, and this is a statistical fact. The book cites the sources if you want to do some fact checking. But the thing is, we are told, society tells us, or there's this perception that crime is increasing dramatically. So we need prisons and the prison institution to deal with that. However, Davis lays down some facts stating that, look, crime was going down. However, prisons were being built at a more rapid rate. So the building of prisons was not a response to higher crime rate. Right? That's not what was going on. So why were these prisons built? Or why do we see this increase in prison production? This is something that we have to think about. Now, here's some more questions we should consider. Yeah, and this is just page 10. I have no reference to where it would be on the text because of the how the e-reader works. So it's on page 10, this text somewhere. Why were people so quick to assume that locking away an increasingly large proportion of the U.S. population would help those who live in the free world feel safer and more secure? This question could be formulated in more general terms. Why do prisons tend to make people think that their own rights and liberties are more secure than they would be if prisons did not exist? What other reasons might there have been for the rapidity with which prisons began to colonize the California landscape? So in this text, Davis focuses on the example of California, which has seen an explosion of prison production. And that's true throughout America as a whole, but particularly in California. That's actually the state I'm from. Why such a massive increase? And why is it that we're told that we should feel safer because we have more and more prisons? I skip 3 paragraphs here. At bottom, there's one fundamental question. Why do we take prison for granted? You make the claim that, prisons actually are bad. They're not useful for society. They're obsolete. And the immediate response is, well, we need prisons, obviously. We have to have them. Because if we don't have them, what are we going to do about crime? And why is there this immediate response without thinking about, okay, maybe let's think about something else. Let's before you just immediately attack and say, oh, we have to have it. Kind of like, somebody were to say, why don't we just do away with oxygen? Of course, your immediate response would be, well, obviously we need oxygen. Human beings have to breathe, right? We assume prisons are as necessary as oxygen. And that simply isn't the case. But why? Why do we take prisons for granted? I'm going to skip down several lines. How many? I don't know. If that's relative to my sizing of the e-reader font. But I am skipping, so if you want to follow along, you can try. It is hardly acceptable to engage in serious public discussions about prison life or radical alternatives to prison. It is as if prison were an inevitable fact of life, like birth and death. On the whole, people tend to take prisons for granted. It is difficult to imagine life without them. At the same time, there is reluctance to face the realities hidden within them, a fear of thinking about what happens inside them. Thus, the prison is present in our lives, and at the same time, it is absent from our lives. Okay, this is important. Listen to this. To think about this simultaneous presence and absence is to begin to acknowledge the part played by ideology in shaping the way we interact with our social surroundings. We take prisons for granted, but are often afraid to face the realities they produce. Let me repeat that. We take prisons for granted, but are often afraid to face the realities they produce. After all, no one wants to go to prison because it would be too agonizing to cope with the possibility that anyone, including ourselves, could become a prisoner. We tend to think of the prison as disconnected from our own lives. This is even true for some of us, women as well as men, who have already experienced imprisonment. We thus think about imprisonment as a fate reserved for others. So you got this cycle going on, right, that reinforces the taking for granted. We take prisons for granted because we don't want to think about prisons, because the reality of prisons are horrifying to the point that we don't even want to think about it. So because we don't want to think about it, we take it for granted. When you start to think about it, we shy. We're like, no, I don't want to even think about it. Therefore, I'm just going to assume that it's necessary. See, it's like negative reinforcement. You got to be brave. You got to talk about upsetting situations. When things become taboo, they can become dangerous. You can't allow fear to prevent you from fixing problems. But I'll continue. I skipped down a few lines. The prison, therefore, functions ideologically as an abstract site into which undesirables are deposited, relieving us of the responsibility of thinking about the real issues afflicting those communities from which prisoners are drawn in, such disproportionate numbers. This is the ideological work that the prison performs. It relieves us from the responsibility of seriously engaging with the problems of our society, especially those produced by racism and increasingly global capitalism. So we got to be brave. We got to talk about this. And that's what we're doing right now. I skipped down a few lines. We live in an era of migrating corporations. In order to escape organized labor in this country, and thus higher wages, benefits, and so on, corporations roam the world in search of nations providing cheap labor pools. This corporate migration thus leaves entire communities in shambles. Huge numbers of people lose jobs and prospects for future jobs. Because the economic base of these communities is destroyed, Education and other surviving social services are profoundly affected. This process turns the men, women, and children who live in these damaged communities into perfect candidates for prison. We're starting to talk about the reality of prison. What prison really is. Is it a place where we deal with crime, or we solve the problem of crime or law breaking? Is that what's going on? Or is it a tool for global capitalism? Which one? Okay, but I'll continue. In the meantime, corporations associated with the punishment industry reap profits from the system that manages prisoners and acquire a clear stake in the continued growth of prison populations. Put simply, this is the era of the prison industrial complex. The prison has become a black hole into which the detritus of contemporary capitalism is deposited. Mass imprisonment generates profits as it devours social wealth, and thus it tends to reproduce the very conditions that lead people to prison. We gotta recognize how prisons are used. They are used for cheap labor, and they target specific kinds of people for that cheap labor. And so if we're thinking like, okay, the reason why prisons exist is because they are a problem solver to crime, right? That's how we're trying to solve the crime issue. So then if that's the case, why is it that prisons make so much profit, so much capital? Why are they a source of revenue for many corporations? What's that all about? Now I am on page 13. The prison is one of the most important features of our image environment. This has caused us to take the existence of prisons for granted. The prison has become a key ingredient of our common sense. It is there all around us. We do not question whether it should exist. It has become so much a part of our lives that it requires a great feat of imagination to envision life beyond the prison. Like what we were saying before, people can't imagine existence without prison. Like, what do you do with the lawbreakers? So then do we turn a blind eye to all the horror and inhumanity that happens within the prison system? Why do we not even try to imagine an alternative? We don't even try. Davis points out that throughout human history, there have been several institutions, inhumane, horrible institutions, that people have just accepted blindly and just didn't really think of an alternative or an escape out of, right? This happens. So let me read you this quote from page 16. This is the second paragraph of chapter 2. The prison is not the only institution that has posed complex challenges to the people who have lived with it and have become so inured to its presence that they could not conceive of society without it. Within the history of the United States, the system of slavery immediately comes to mind. Although as early as the American Revolution, anti-slavery advocates promoted the elimination of African bondage. It took almost a century to achieve the abolition of the peculiar institution, quote unquote. The belief in the permanence of slavery was so widespread that even white abolitionists found it difficult to imagine black people as equals. There was a time where slavery in America was just a fact of life, and many people just could not even fathom life without slavery, right? And Davis even talks about how there were some abolitionists that, they talked about, we should, reform slavery. We should make slavery less humane. But we can't really imagine a world where slavery doesn't exist. So this is not new, right? When you confront it with a system that's part of society that's so ingrained, yet it's like very horrible and it's obsolete, and it's like maybe it's time for human beings to move past it. However, there's this lack of imagination, this lack of philosophical inquiry as to where do we go? What steps does society have to take for this inhumane reality to no longer exist? Here's another example. On page 16, I will read. Segregation ruled the South until it was outlawed a century after the abolition of slavery. Many people lived under Jim Crow could not envision a legal system defined by racial equality. Same thing. Yeah. You had the Jim Crow laws, and people were like, well, that's just how it is. Like, could you imagine life without it? I can't do it. Right? I mean, this was common, right, back then. I skipped down several lines. Anyone who would dare to call the reintroduction of slavery, the organization of lynch mobs, or the reestablishment of legal segregation would be summarily dismissed. But it should be remembered that the ancestors of many of today's most ardent liberals could not have imagined life without slavery, without lynching, or life without segregation. So keep that in mind when you have that immediate response of, there's no way that we can live in a society without prisons. Well, there was a time when people also said, there's no way we can live in a society without slavery. Oh, there's no way we can live in a society without racial segregation. It just can't be. There is a way. There is a possibility. Let's continue reading. This is page 17. It may help us gain perspective on the prison if we try to imagine how strange and discomforting the debates about the obsolescence of slavery must have been to those who took the peculiar institution. That's some of the lingo that was used to refer to the institution of slavery back then, for granted. And especially to those who reaped direct benefits from this dreadful system of racist exploitation. If we are already persuaded that racism should not be allowed to define the planet's future, and if we can successfully argue that prisons are racist institutions, this may lead us to take seriously the prospect of declaring prisons obsolete. Now we're getting to the part why I call this channel the Black Ponder, and not just the Ponder, right? Because race is a thing that affects our lives. And it's part of the reason why we don't question prisons, because prisons and their relationship with racism is so ingrained in our minds that we don't even think about it. But I'm trying to bring it to light. Now we're on page 18. Are prisons racist institutions? Is racism so deeply entrenched in the institution of the prison that it is not possible to eliminate one without eliminating the other? These are questions that we should keep in mind as we examine the historical links between U.S. slavery and the early penitentiary system. The penitentiary, as an institution that simultaneously punished and rehabilitated its inhabitants, was a new system of punishment that first made its appearance in the United States around the time of the American Revolution. This new system was based on the replacement of capital and corporal punishment by incarceration. Right, so the idea around the American Revolutionary days was that, okay, we can create this system that instead of using capital and corporal punishment to deal with crime, instead, we should just put people in prison. That's how we deal with criminals. But much like how slavery was used as a form of cheap to free labor, using people who are imprisoned, right, imprisoned, essentially slaves, who were prisoners, we can look at the prison system and see that, okay, these are also imprisoned people who corporations and companies use for cheap to free labor. And much of the prison system is predominantly people of color. There are parallels between these institutions, slavery and the prison system. This is what Davis is getting at. This quote is from page 26. We have learned how to recognize the role of slave labor, as well as the racism it embodied. But black convict labor remains a hidden dimension of our history. It is extremely unsettling to think of modern industrialized urban areas as having been originally produced under the racist labor conditions of the penal servitude that are often described by historians as even worse than slavery. Much of industrialized urban areas have been built by prison labor, by black convict labor. Okay, there's parallels here. Let's talk about that more. Okay, this is page 32. The prison sentence, which is always computed in terms of time, is related to abstract quantification, evoking the rise of science in what is often referred to as the Age of Reason. We should keep in mind that this was precisely the historical period when the value of labor began to be calculated in terms of time, and therefore compensated in another quantifiable way, by money. The computability of state punishment in terms of time, days, months, years, resonates with the role of labor, time, as a basis for computing the value of capitalist commodities. Think about it. The prison sentence as a form of capital. Think about how much labor that's cheap or free the prison system produces as capital, and how that can be measured in terms of a prisoner's sentence. How corporations make this kind of calculus. So understand, prisons definitely generate capital through labor. That's not a way to solve crime, right? Or reduce the amount of laws being broken. Okay, how does that solve that issue? It really doesn't, right? Right, so that's one issue. Let's talk about another issue. This is page 37. No one, not even the most ardent defenders of the super maximum prisons that are dedicated to the most heinous criminals, right? That's the idea. Would try to argue today that absolute segregation, including sensory deprivation, is restorative and healing. We're talking about solitary confinement. Is that restorative and healing? Yeah, nobody would really say that that is, right? Rather, that's extreme torture, right? That's what that is. But I'll continue reading. The prevailing justification for the supermax is that the horrors it creates are the perfect complement for the horrifying personalities deemed the worst of the worst by the prison system. In other words, there's no pretense that rights are respected. There's no concern for the individual. There's no sense that men and women incarcerated in supermaxes deserve anything approaching respect and comfort. You know, it's commonly understood, if you ask average Joe, our prisons are a place of healing or reform where people learn to do better and become better people. Very few people are going to say, oh yes, that's what prisons are. Most people know the truth. Like, prisons are essentially torture machines and horrible things go down in the prison. Everybody's going to say that. The idea is like, well, they did this incredibly horrible thing. They deserve this incredibly horrible punishment. The question you have to ask yourself is, well, does that work in terms of stopping crime or heinous acts from happening in human society? Is that like a problem solver, or is that not really helping at all? In fact, is making heinous crime increase? That's the question that you have to ask. Does prisons effectively solve the problem of crime? It's pretty obvious the answer is no. Yet we allow prisons still to exist. Why? Let me read you this quote from page 40. Mumia Abu Jamal, who has challenged the contemporary dismantling of prison education programs, asked in Live from Death Row, that's a text that this person wrote, what societal interest is served by prisoners who remain illiterate? What social benefit is there in ignorance? How are people corrected while in prison if their education is outlawed? Who profits, other than the prison establishment itself, from stupid prisoners? Think about that, because there used to exist an education system within prison. You used to be able to get your degree in prison, right? College level degrees. A lot of that's been taken away. In fact, most of it has been taken away. Does that even exist anymore? I don't think so, but I might be wrong. But for the most part, education within prisons no longer exists. Why? Why was that taken away? This idea that oh well, they're being punished, so why would we reward them with education? Right? So I think that's the prevailing idea. Like, oh, you're wasting resources. But making a criminal better, or reforming a criminal, right? Making a person less likely to conduct crime, a great way to do that is to educate them, right? That's a great method to use to stop that person from committing crime. By not educating them, they're more likely to commit crime, right? So why is this happening? Who benefits from that? You have to ask yourself. Obviously, somebody's benefiting from it, the prison system itself, because now they're, without education, the person who conducted the crime to get to prison and then leaves prison is more likely to cause a crime and then go right back to the prison. Is the prison institution supporting itself? Notice again that is the issue of crime being solved. Is the point of all of this solving the problem of crime? No, right? This is why prisons are obsolete. Okay, here I am on page 42. Some of the many prisoners who earned their degrees at Greenhaven, a prison, pursued postgraduate studies after their release. As the documentary powerfully demonstrates, there was a documentary about this education program. The program produced dedicated men who left prison and offered their newly acquired knowledge and skills to their communities on the outside, right? So education works in everybody's favor. Again, it's less likely for somebody to commit a crime if they're educated. And the more educated they are, the less likely they are to commit a crime, as shown in this documentary that Davis is talking about. Yet it's been taken away. What's going on? Let me read you this quote from page 60. Why is an understanding of the pervasiveness of sexual abuse in women's prisons an important element of a radical analysis of the prison system, and especially of those forward-looking analysis that lead us in the direction of abolition? Because the call to abolish the prison as the dominant form of punishment cannot ignore the extent to which the institution of the prison has stockpiled ideas and practices that are hopefully approaching obsolescence in the larger society, but that retain all their ghastly vitality behind prison walls. The destructive combination of racism and misogyny, however much it has been challenged by social movements, scholarship, and art over the last 3 decades, retains all its awful consequences within women's prisons. The relatively contested presence of sexual abuse in women's prisons is one of many such examples. The increasing evidence of a U.S. prison industrial complex with global resonances leads us to think about the extent to which the many corporations that have acquired an investment in the expansion of the prison system are, like the state, directly implicated in an institution that perpetuates violence against women. So it's not just prisons for men, it's also prisons for women. A lot of the violence women deal with in prison is sexual abuse. So again, we look at the prison system for men and women, and we look at the dehumanizing effect of these institutions, and it just tells you, okay, these institutions are obsolete. They're just as obsolete as slavery. They're just as obsolete as Jim Crow, because they're not solving the problem that they're supposed to be solving. Were they ever designed to solve that problem in the first place? Let's keep reading. The prison industrial complex was introduced by activists and scholars to contest prevailing beliefs that increased levels of crime were the root cause of mounting prison populations. Instead, they argued prison construction and the attendant drive to fill these new structures with human bodies have been driven by ideologies of racism and the pursuit of profit. Now I skip a few lines down. To understand the social meaning of the prison today within the context of a developing prison industrial complex means that punishment has to be conceptually severed from its seemingly indissoluble link with crime. How often do we encounter the phrase crime and punishment? Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. I have a video about that. we encounter it a lot. To what extent has the perpetual repetition of the phrase crime and punishment in literature as titles of television shows, both fictional and documentary, and in everyday conversation made it extremely difficult to think about punishment beyond this connection? How have these portrayals located the prison in a casual relation to crime as a natural, necessary, and permanent effect, thus inhibiting serious debates about the viability of the prison today? The notion of a prison industrial complex insists on understandings of the punishment process that take into account economic and political structures and ideologies, rather than focusing myopically on individual criminal conduct and efforts to curb crime. The fact, for example, that many corporations with global markets now rely on prisons as an important source of profit helps us to understand the rapidity with which prisons begin to proliferate precisely at a time when official studies indicate that crime rate was falling. So Davis brings up a good point. Why is it that we always associate solving crime with punishment? Oh, you did something, you broke the law, you got to be punished. Because that works, right? Punishment works, right? That's how people stop being criminals. It obviously doesn't work, as we could see in society. But that link that has been drilled in your mind through media, literature, movies, documentaries, and pop culture, it makes it very difficult for us to figure out, okay, maybe instead of punishing people or instead of giving people incredibly hard times, like torturing them, giving them solitary confinement, abusing them, whether sexually or physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, rather than doing that, maybe we should do something else. Maybe that's the way we solve crime. But really what Davis is getting at is the prisons are just a method of social economic control. It's a way to generate capital and keep certain people down at the bottom of the social ladder and keep other people at the top. At the end of the day, that's what the prison system is. This quote is from page 64. Corporations producing all kinds of goods, from buildings to electronic devices and hygiene products, and providing all kinds of services from meals to therapy and healthcare, are now directly involved in the punishment business. That is to say, companies that one would assume are far removed from the work of state punishment have developed major stakes in the perpetuation of a prison system whose historical obsolescence is therefore that much more difficult to recognize. Since the prison system is so involved in the labor production of common commodities, it's even more difficult to separate, to recognize the obsolescence of prison because it's so involved in our daily lives without us even thinking about it. So what's the alternative? All right. Well, so if we don't have prisons, what do we do about crime? Let me read you some quotes. This is page 67. Forget about reform. It's time to talk about abolishing jails and prisons in American society. Still, abolition? Where do you put the prisoners, the criminals? What's the alternative? First, having no alternative at all would create less crime than the present criminal training centers do. Second, the only full alternative is building the kind of society that does not need prisons. Redistribution of power and income so as to put out the hidden fire of burning envy that now flames up in crimes of property, both burglary by the poor and embezzlement by the affluent. And a decent sense of community that can support, reintegrate, and truly rehabilitate those who suddenly become filled with fury or despair, and that can face them not as objects, criminals, but as people who have committed illegal acts, as have almost all of us. And the person that wrote this, Davis is quoting author Waskow, who's from the Institute for Policy Studies. So we have to think about a society that doesn't need prisons. What would a society look like? Let me keep reading. This is page 77. It is true that if we focus myopically on the existing system, and perhaps this is the problem that leads to the assumption that imprisonment is the only alternative to death, it is very hard to imagine a structurally similar system capable of handling such a vast population of lawbreakers. If, however, we shift our attention from the prison, perceived as an isolated institution, to the set of relationships that comprise the prison industrial complex, it may be easier to think about alternatives. In other words, a more complicated framework may yield more options than if we simply attempt to discover a single substitute for the prison system. The first step, then, will be to let go of the desire to discover one single alternative system of punishment that would occupy the same footprint as the prison system. So basically, we need to diversify our way of thinking about the problem. Rather than one solution fits all these problems, recognize that the problem of crime is actually a multitude of problems. And there's got to be many solutions working together in tangent, in parallel with each other to solve this overall issue. Got to start thinking more deeply. Let me continue reading. The prison industrial complex is much more than the sum of all the jails and prisons in this country. It is a set of symbiotic relationships among correctional communities, transnational corporations, media conglomerates, guards, unions, and legislative and court agendas. If it is true that the contemporary meaning of punishment is fashioned through these relationships, then the most effective abolitionist strategies will contest these relationships and propose alternatives that pull them apart. What then would it mean to imagine a system in which punishment is not allowed to become the source of corporate profit? Okay, that's one thing. We should not allow the solving of crime to be a source of corporate profit. That shouldn't be a thing. Okay, that's one solution. But let me continue reading. How could we imagine a society in which race and class are not primary determinants of punishment, or one in which punishment itself is no longer the central concern in the making of justice? An abolitionist approach that seeks to answer questions such as these would require us to imagine a constellation of alternatives, strategies, and institutions, with the ultimate aim of removing the prison from the social and ideological landscapes of our society. In other words, we would not be looking for prison-like substitutes for the prison. Okay, so how do we solve the prison problem? Well, what else can we do? Well, maybe we can do something radically different, something that doesn't even look like a prison at all. But let me keep reading. Rather positing decarceration as our overarching strategy, we would try to envision a continuum of alternatives to imprisonment: demilitarization of schools, revitalization of education at all levels, a health system that provides free physical and mental care to all, a justice system based on reparations and reconciliation rather than retribution and vengeance. Okay, there's some solutions. We're starting to list them. The creation of new institutions that lay claim to the space now occupied by the prison can eventually start to crowd out the prison so that it would inhabit increasingly smaller areas of our social and psychic landscape. Schools can therefore be seen as the most powerful alternative to jails and prisons. Unless the current structures of violence are eliminated from schools in impoverished communities of color, including the presence of armed security guards and police, and unless schools become places that encourage the joy of learning, these schools will remain the major conduits to prisons. The alternative would be to transform schools into vehicles for decarceration. Okay, I mean, we're talking about solutions here. Instead of prisons, we could do these things. So it's not like we don't have any ideas. Davis lays them out, but let me continue. Within the healthcare system, it is important to emphasize the current scarcity of institutions available to poor people who suffer severe mental and emotional illnesses. There are currently more people with mental and emotional disorders in jails and prisons than in mental institutions. That's another thing that we can focus on. Let me keep going. I skipped down a few lines. To reiterate, rather than try to imagine one single alternative to existing systems of incarceration, we might envision an array of alternatives that will require radical transformations of many aspects of our society. Alternatives that fail to address racism, male dominance, homophobia, class bias, and other structures of domination will not, in the final analysis, lead to decarceration and will not advance the goal of abolition. It is within this context that it makes sense to consider the decriminalization of drug use as a significant component of a larger strategy to simultaneously oppose structures of racism within the criminal justice system and further the abolitionist agenda of decarceration. the so-called war on drugs. Okay, that's another thing. Where now states are starting to legalize the use of marijuana. Decriminalizing the use of various drugs. Another problem solver. Here's another one. This is page 79. Poor people deserve to have access to effective voluntary drug treatment programs. Like the Betty Ford program, their operations should not be under the auspices of the criminal justice system. As at the Ford Center, family members also should be permitted to participate. But unlike the Betty Ford program, they should be free of charge. Okay. For such programs to count as abolitionist alternatives, they would not be linked, unlike existing programs to which individuals are sentenced to imprisonment as a last resort. What about this one? This is page 80. Current campaigns that call for the decriminalization of undocumented immigrants are making important contributions to the overall struggle against the prison industrial complex and are challenging the expansive reach of racism and male dominance. Decriminalization of undocumented immigrants. That's another solution. You gotta look at the factual data. Does undocumented immigration lead to a rise in crime? Well, the perception is yes, but a lot of that is unfounded and baseless, right? If you look at the statistics, you'll see that actually it doesn't. But I'll continue. This is page 81. Thus, a vast range of alternative strategies of minimizing violence against women within intimate relationships and within relationships to the state should be the focus of our concern. Okay, that's another solution. I skip down some lines. Job and living wage programs, alternatives to the disestablished welfare program, community-based recreation, and many more. And I skip down several more lines. Creating agendas of decarceration and broadly casting their net of alternatives helps us to do the ideological work of pulling apart the conceptual link between crime and punishment. This more nuanced understanding of the social role of the punishment system requires us to give up our usual way of thinking about punishment as an inevitable consequence of crime. We would recognize that punishment, quote, does not follow from crime in the neat and logical sequence offered by discourses that insist on the justice of imprisonment, but rather punishment, primarily through imprisonment and sometimes death, is linked to the agendas of politicians, the profit drive of corporations, and media representations of crime. Imprisonment is associated with the racialization of those most likely to be punished. It is associated with their class and, as we have seen, gender structures, the punishment system as well. If we insist that abolitionist alternatives trouble these relationships, that they strive to disarticulate crime and punishment, race and punishment, class and punishment, and gender and punishment, then our focus must not rest only on the prison system as an isolated institution, but must also be directed at all the social relations that support the permanence of the prison. An attempt to create a new conceptual terrain for imagining alternatives to imprisonment involves the ideological work of questioning why criminals have been constituted as a class, and indeed a class of human beings undeserving of the civil and human rights accorded to others. I skipped down several more lines. This is page 82. Programs for decriminalization will not only have to address specific activities that have been criminalized, such as drug use and sex work, but also criminalize populations and communities. Okay, that's another solution. Decriminalize sex work and decriminalize being black. Just throwing it out there. Driving while black should not be a thing. Okay, just saying, Black Lives Matter. Okay, but we're gonna keep going. This is page 83. The lawbreaker is thus no longer an evil-minded man or woman, but simply a debtor or a liable person whose human duty is to take responsibility for his or her acts and to assume the duty of repair. So as you can see, there are many solutions that we can implement as an alternative to prisons. It's not the case that there is no way we can operate in our society without prisons. We definitely can. We just have to do the ideological work, as Davis says, and more importantly and specifically, we need the will. We need the political will, and we need to get the word out, and we need to get eyes open about this issue, prison abolition. I think Professor Davis is right. Prisons really are obsolete. She asked that question, and she basically answers it. Are prisons obsolete? Yes. And we need to live in a society without them. Prisons do not solve the problem of crime. They just don't. What they do instead is they just dehumanize people to generate cheap profit and to keep certain people of the bottom of the social economic ladder and certain other people at the top of the social economic ladder. That's really what prison is about. I would like you to think about that. And if you want to continue the discussion below in the comments section, I'll be there. But while you're doing that, why don't you check out Angela Davis's Are Prisons Obsolete? It's a great read. There's even more facts, figures, data, philosophical analysis that I didn't even touch on. I'm going to leave that up to you to read. In any case, you've been watching The Black Ponder. Tune in next time for more philosophical thought.